Okay, so in this section we will compare and contrast types of muscle tissue. So here there are three types of muscle tissue. You've got cardiac muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and skeletal muscle tissue. Now, the location of each differ. The cardiac muscle tissue can be found in the heart, and specifically the myocardia, which are the walls of the heart. Contrastingly, smooth muscle tissue are found in, well, also walls, but walls of tubes in the body and of blood vessels. Also different to this, skeletal muscles are found connected to bones of the skeleton, and they are connected by tendons. The structure of each also differ. In cardiac muscle, they are uninuclear or binuclear. They differ, they can be both. And they are also branched like this to spread the impulses from the sinoatrial node, which is the natural pacemaker of the heart, which is located at the myocardia, the right atrium. Similarly, smooth are uninuclear, but they can't be binuclear, they are only uninuclear. And they are of a fusiform shape, so they are wide in the middle, but they are small at the ends, and this means that they can be tightly packed and layered. Differently, skeletal muscles are multinuclear. They are cylindrical shape and striated, as well as cardiac muscles. So both skeletal and cardiac muscles are striated. The function of them, so the function of cardiac muscle tissue is when the myocardium contracts at the same time to contract the heart and contribute to vascular shunt. So the role of this is, because they are branched, the cardiac muscle tissue is branched. That means that they can spread that impulse quickly, so they can then all contract at the same time to have one uniform contraction to make it more efficient. And when they contract, that means they then force the blood through to the next chamber through the valves, or like the left ventricle, that goes to the aorta, which then goes to the rest of the body, and the right ventricle, that goes through the pulmonary artery to the lungs to become oxygenized through gaseous exchange. Smooth muscle tissue vasoconstrict and dilate to distribute blood flow proportions around the body. So they differ to cardiac muscles, as they are used to control how much blood is distributed to sections of the body, whereas the heart is just pumping a constant amount of blood to the whole of the body, or to the lungs, for example, as a exception. So with the smooth muscle tissue, they vasodilate to reduce the amount of blood flow going to that area. So if it's not being used during sport, then there's a less of a demand for blood in that area. So the arteries and arterioles around there would vasodilate to reduce the amount of oxygenated blood going there to that area, and for the areas that are being used and need a high demand or have a high demand of oxygen needed for the muscles to work appropriately, then the blood vessels will vasodilate to increase the blood flow in that area. Differently, skeletal muscles are part of the musculoskeletal system, and their main function is to create movement by pulling on bones to create movement, and they are connected via tendons. The size of them also differ. So we have the smooth muscle, as they are a fusiform shape. That means that they can be layered and tightly packed, and so that means that they are actually the smallest. One cell of a smooth muscle tissue is the smallest out of all the three. And then the cardiac muscle is then the next smallest, and it's still very small. So is similar to the smooth muscle tissue, but is just a little bit larger when it comes to size. Skeletal muscle tissue then is the largest, and they vary in size a lot. And with the largest muscle being up to 30 centimeters, and that is the sartorius muscle in the upper thigh. The control of each muscle, so cardiac muscle is involuntary, as it constantly has to contract and relax to pump blood around the body and supply oxygen to muscles. So if that was involuntary, then obviously we could make the heart stop, and obviously we would die because the oxygen wouldn't be supplying to our body, which is what we need. Similarly, smooth muscle is also involuntary and is also involved in processes like digestion, which is an involuntary process. We can't control that, and so smooth muscle tissue needs to be involuntary, as that process needs to happen naturally. Also skeletal muscle tissue, that can be both voluntary. No, that is voluntary, sorry. As it needs to consciously decide what movement to do, as this will change during everyday life and also sporting movements. So the movement speed and all that is varied, whereas the other two are constant. So that is why skeletal muscle tissue is a voluntary muscle. Next is fatigability. Firstly, cardiac muscle, it has a slow rhythmic contraction speed, so isn't fatiguing if it has an oxygen supply. As it's slow working, it means it can rely aerobically to create enough energy to contract the heart. And also, if it was fatiguing, that means eventually it would need to stop to recover. And obviously, if it stopped, we would die due to the lack of oxygen being supplied to our body. Similarly, smooth muscle tissue is also non-fatiguing, as contraction speed is also slow, but is very slow, meaning it won't use up much energy over a set period of time, so it can then constantly constantly work without fatigue, and so doesn't need to stop. Skeletal muscle tissue, however, does fatigue, but that time can vary depending if it works aerobically or anaerobically. So if it's aerobically, this could last up to many hours, but if it's working anaerobically, it can only last a couple of minutes maximum. For like top elite athletes, could last approximately up to like 2 minutes with it maximum. And finally, respiration. So cardiac muscle, as it's fatigue resistant, as it doesn't fatigue, it must work with aerobic respiration to supply it oxygen for it to work. Because we know that aerobic respiration can work for a very long time, like in skeletal muscles. So, but due to the slower contraction speed, that means it uses even less energy than skeletal muscles, meaning it can work, well, for a long time, like 80 years on average for a human, constantly. And that is why it needs to be working with aerobic respiration. Smooth muscle tissue also works with aerobic respiration because it's also a non-fatiguing due to the slow or very slow contraction speeds. And so obviously needs oxygen for energy to perform its primary function constantly. And finally, skeletal muscle tissue. Well, we know that it can work both aerobically and anaerobically, with it working a long time aerobically with oxygen, but then it can also work anaerobically by using the glycogen stores in the muscle for energy, but this can't be maintained for very long, as a waste product of this process is lactic acid, which then builds up as a waste product and eventually forces us to stop working, as we need to get rid of that waste product. That will end the second video on the muscular system. Next video we will look at skeletal muscle growth anatomy.